Hi, everyone. I'm Monica Molinaro. Thanks so much for joining me again for another episode of Ask 5. In today's episode, I'm joined by Antoine. Thank you so much for joining me. I was wondering if you'd be willing to introduce yourself to our audience today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Monica. My name is Antoine Przybylak Brouillard. I'm a PhD candidate at the Institute of Health Sciences Education, and I'm also a research associate at the McGill University Health Center Research Center.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. So, to really dive into the episode, do you want to introduce what our question is for the episode?
Yeah, I'd love to. So our question today will be, what are the things to avoid when starting out in the health sciences education research space?
Very important question. So we'll see what our 5 have to say and check back in after.
Yeah, let's do it.
So today I'm joined by...
I'm Stuart Lubarsky. I'm a neurologist. I do general neurology at the Montreal General Hospital, and I'm also associated with the Institute of Health Sciences Education, where I'm a faculty member.
I'm Elizabeth Ann Kinsella, and I am director and professor at the Institute of Health Sciences Education in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at McGill University.
Tina Martimianakis from the University of Toronto. I'm professor in the Department of Pediatrics and director of medical education scholarship there. And I'm a scientist at the Wilson Center and associate director of the Wilson Center, and I oversee the portfolio that's about collaborations and partnerships.
Martin Pusick. I'm an associate professor of both pediatrics and emergency medicine at the Harvard Medical School, and I'm the director of the Research and Education Foundation at the American Board of Medical Specialties.
Suzanne Mack, Occupational Therapy Program at the School of Physical and Occupational Therapy and member of the Institute of Health Sciences Education at McGill University.
When I'm just starting out in the health sciences or the health professions education space, are there things that I should avoid doing when I'm entering into this world for the first time?
Fair enough. Good question. I guess my best advice for that would be, don't bite off more than you can chew. Start out easy, start out slow. You don't have to take on more than you can handle. And I imagine that, the audiences who are going to be listening to this are largely those who have a lot of other stuff going on in their lives, whether they're coming through medicine or education programs or what have you. Be careful. Don't overexert yourself. Right? The temptation is probably to, might be to do too much or agree to do too much or take on too much right from the start. And that doesn't do anybody a service. It doesn't do you a service. It doesn't do your team a service. Eventually you'll collapse under the weight. And so it's okay to start slow. You keep using the analogy of dipping your toes in the water, and you should really do that. That's okay. You don't need to plunge into the deep end right from the start, because you can break your neck like that.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because I feel like that's a piece of advice that I've heard as someone who's very early career at this point in time. Even when I was on the job market or looking for a position, one of the first pieces of advice and one of the most constant pieces of advice I got was, you don't need to say yes to everything.
Yep, people will tell you that. And I would echo that. It's very hard. I get that. So it's difficult. It's easier said than done when you are starting out, and especially when you do have a lot to offer. I mean, you are valuable and you are valued, and so people are going to try to take advantage of that, and not in a sinister sense. You have a lot that they want, and so of course they're going to ask you to do things. Be careful. Just be careful not to take on too much, and it is okay to say no. It's also okay to say not now. A nice way to say no sometimes is yes, but I have a lot going on right now, and this is something that I'm very interested in and I would love to be a part of, but I don't think it's the right time for me right now. But I hope that I'm not closing a door in the future.
I like that. We're existing outside of the binary in a lot of our conversation today.
Yeah.
So it doesn't need to be a definitive yes, all in. It also doesn't need to be a definitive no, I can't. That's it.
That's right.
This is a hard question because I think we learn from experience, and we can all make missteps as we go, and that will be different for everybody potentially. I think one of the things that I often noticed with more junior researchers is that there's a tendency to want to save the world and want to make grand claims. So usually our contributions in research are quite modest. We need to narrow down our scope of research, and we're able to make really important but often quite modest contributions. And so I would say one thing to avoid is to overstate the impact or the implications of your work. It's often why work isn't accepted in a journal, because the work is overgeneralized beyond the actual scope of the methodology of the work. So if a more modest claim is put forward, it can be justified and it can be verified, and it is a legitimate claim. But people have a tendency to want to overstate, I think, the implications of their research or their work, and to generalize it beyond what the actual design of the research allows it to be generalized. So there's a lot of work that can be transferable practically to multiple contexts. But when we make those universal statements about generalizability in every context, I think then we start to get into trouble. So I find in general, it's kind of a fatal flaw that I often point out in junior scholars is this is beautiful work, this is important work, but but we need to be a bit more modest in our claims. So humility, I think, as a researcher, humility about what we're actually contributing, recognizing it's still very, very important, but we're not overstating it.
I also, along that lines of maintaining humility here, I want to pick something up that you said at the very beginning of your answer, and that was that you're going to be making missteps along the way. And so I'm wondering, is one of these things to be aware of or essentially avoid doing is going in with an assumption that you're never going to make a mistake or that you're never going to bump into something that ultimately might meet you with a little bit of resistance along the way?
Yeah, I mean it's a really great point, and it sort of goes back to the growth mindset that when you make a mistake, what do you do with it? So if you have a rejection of a paper, what do you do with it? For me, I take time to reflect on it. I try to see it as an opportunity to grow. Sometimes I recognize it's just the socially situated nature of the work, that the reviewer didn't understand what I was doing, and I try to put that into perspective. So trying not to take those failures or those missteps too personally, but as opportunities to grow and learn, goes a really long way in terms of advancing as a scholar.
And picking up on that piece as well, not taking things personally. You are going to grow as a person throughout this trajectory, or as long as you're doing this research, but understanding that commentary on your work isn't commentary on who you are as a person.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a hard lesson to learn, and everybody has different sort of coping strategies in terms of how they process and deal, because there can be quite a bit of rejection. So sometimes there's highs and lows in the academic world. You get your paper accepted, you're so excited, you send the next paper in, and the reviewers don't like it. So there's this sort of trajectory of extreme highs and sometimes lows as well. Yeah, good point. And it's not personal. It's often not personal. So one of the things about scholarship is if you're taking on a concept, if you are really investigating a phenomenon, then you really need to do your due diligence about what is that phenomenon, what have others said, before I take a stage in front of an international crowd and say, what I think about it without doing that background research. So I guess just in terms of possible missteps is not doing your due diligence of research in the phenomenon you're investigating before you take center stage to talk about it.
don't try to do something that's out of your core strength when you're first starting out. I think you need to build. I tell this to my kids as well. I mean, you put your best foot forward, and then you start building new things and new learning, and to try to do something from scratch again. You're not redoing your PhD coming into the field. You've just become an expert in something, right? You've just finished a master's degree. You've just finished a big project. Use that. Use that as a starting point for the next project, because it makes it a little bit easier, because you're starting from a center of strength, and then you can build in new things as you go along. And that's how we build research programs, one step at a time. And when I say a research program, I come from the social sciences, where it's not as it's not the same topic all the time. And in fact, content areas, if you look at my CV, they're all over the place. But there's a thread. And there's a phenomenon that I track throughout. And by doing that and working with some of the same concepts with different content area, I was able to build in that content area. Otherwise, you'd be driving yourself crazy with trying to do all that and trying to learn everything from scratch. No one should do that.
No. How would you suggest then, in thinking about this, if you're just starting out in research for the first time, how would you suggest somebody go and find what their strengths are to play off them later on?
Who are you? So first starting, like not doing a graduate degree, like just have an interest, right? So this is where having we call them consultation meetings at U of T, but sometimes they're called something else in different places. We meet people who have an interest in something educational and they don't know where to take it. And those conversations really are, for the person providing the guidance or the consultation, their job is to help you figure out what your strengths are, right? So they sort of feel like you're being kind of interviewed, right? Do you have any training in methods? You're interested in experimental methodology, but you've only done interviews. You had some experience doing interviews. So if your next project is going to be an experimental design and you haven't studied anything related to, experimental design, then you have to start from scratch, right? So what can you do in your area of interest with the strengths that you have? And if you just have an interest and you have the problem, you have access to the problem, and you don't have the methodological training, your strength is not that you're bringing that methodological training or research expertise. Your strength is that you have the entry point. So we build that out and we say, who's the team around you then? And we try to find the right mentorship for that person. So it's often not trying to be who you are not, but seeing what you bring to the project.
I think that one of the things that I show in my talks to young scholars is a particular study of NIH researchers in emergency medicine. And so in this study, what they did was they looked at when a particular emergency medicine researcher got their first R01. An R01 is a difficult NIH level, CIHR level grant, and so that they're very, very difficult to get. And so when you get one of those, you kind of arrived. That's a stamp of approval that you are, kind of a full-fledged researcher scientist that you've done, and so it carries tremendous currency in the U.S. But for our purposes, we'll call it a marker of you've arrived. And what they did in this study is they went back and they graphed how many publications they had 1 year prior to getting their R01, how many publications they had 2 years prior, 3 years prior, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And what they showed was that 10 years prior to their first R01, they had very, very few publications, and in fact, it was slow going. They had, 0, 1, 2, kind of thing. And then the thing heats up, right? And so that so 5 years out they've got 20, and 7 years out they've got 90. And I'm making up numbers, but the point is that it's this bent exponential line in which when they're about to arrive at their R01, at their threshold of becoming a scientist, they're firing on all cylinders and they're publishing tremendously. And that we already knew, right? They're successful, and so success gets manifested to some greater or lesser extent in terms of number of publications. But when you look back to the beginning of their publication record, it's slow. It's not very many. It's not linear straight line in terms of getting to that level. And what that means is that when you're starting out, you have to pay your dues. And so you're learning, you're assembling your network, you're going down your false passages, you're learning how to do an ANOVA, you're learning how to, kind of what qualitative research looks like. You're learning, kind of the clinical phenomenon that you're studying in terms of intraoperative communication during crises or, kind of whatever it is. And so learning that stuff, you need to give yourself permission to take the time to learn each of those things, recognizing that you're not going to publish, and so that you're spending this time investing in yourself and letting later what happens deeper into that curve is you start to meet people at conferences and you start to get publications where you showed up to a couple of phone calls and that was enough to influence the thing for them to decide to send the thing for your input and it's relatively little work and you get a publication out of that and so on, and so that when your network gets filled up and your conferences and you're fully going on all cylinders, the publication part of it takes care of itself. But to get there, you need to have mastered your literature. You need to have mastered your techniques. You need to have mastered the clinical area that you're going to do. And so what I'm doing is kind of flipping your question around in terms of what not to do at the outset. And what I'm going to say is that what you should not do is say, I'm going to publish 10 articles as a first-year scholar. Just concentrate on your thesis or your, kind of the thing and just worry about that and do that super well, paying attention to the skills and the development that it is engendering in you. And leave aside the notion that you would kind of hunt to do a publication for publication's sake, in which that time you don't get back to, kind of have done something that's more authentically going to make you better for the long run.
A challenge that I've seen in health sciences education that sort of the research comes in an afterthought and then we're sort of backtracking and then it's hard to make that alignment between the question and the intervention.
Because at that point, it's like someone once described that to me as trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, yes. Where it's like the research comes after because you didn't think of it at the beginning. You now have to spend time trying to like mold things to get them to fit into a research project, which ultimately makes the research suffer.
Exactly. And then it's hard to share that, right? Because the limitations are really evident. And those are not necessarily fixable after the process, right? It needs to be sort of – so I think, people who are thinking about doing research, on their project need to think carefully, take their time, consult researchers that can say, well, here's how I see this, so that you're doing that from the beginning. But I agree with you. I think that's an excellent analogy. Mm-hmm. I think the thought that comes to mind is your passion. This is really important. Don't engage in research that you're not interested in, for the sake of, moving your career along or to please somebody else. Do research that you're interested in, that you're passionate about. That passion helps to drive the energies, the effort. It's evident when you present your findings, people see that passion And then it helps to also captivate the audience and build the visibility of what you're doing and engage other people. And that's another way you can build collaborations. So once you show that passion, people are drawn to you and they say, oh, well, I want to be part of that too. So I think that's really important. I don't think people should engage in a degree where they're just the sake of doing the degree. The passion has to be there from the beginning, because when you're going through those ups and downs of doing empirical research, the passion is what helps to lift you from those depths of frustration. So I think that's something that is an important takeaway, that if you're going to engage in research, make sure that you love what you're going to be doing.
Definitely. Because I think it's something that we take for granted, right? Like there's a lot of people that kind of come into this world and do it for the sake of doing it, or because someone else maybe asked them to and they don't necessarily have the passion for it. And a lot of the times the research and you end up suffering as a result.
Absolutely. And then those questions of, well, they didn't make a substantial contribution comes in. And so why didn't they make that substantial contribution? Well, maybe they weren't as invested.
Definitely. Okay, so Antoine, what did you think?
I'd love to start by talking about the question.
Yeah.
I love the question. And I think like what to avoid is a great, like everyone wants to avoid a minefield. No one wants to just like fall on the same thing that everybody else has fallen on, or in the same trap. And so I think it's a great question, but it's a tough one too, because you don't really know what to avoid before you've really gone through it. So it's really cool to ask these experts, and they all had different things to say. But I think like overall, if we're like look at it, like kind of look at the pattern of it, is really like they're basically saying like take your time, go in there, think about what you want to do, like really like consider your research question, follow a question that like is passionate to you, and don't like burn yourself out. Don't go too fast. Don't like Stuart said, don't break your neck. So like I think that that really says something, but it's also very different from the culture of academia, because like when you're in academia, and maybe this is just me, but it's sort of like, okay, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to publish, you got to do presentation, you got to work on your thesis, you got to do this again. And what they're saying is the opposite. They're like, focus on the thing you got to be doing, don't get distracted, like really take your time. The time will come to do the publications. So it's sort of counterintuitive.
I agree. I feel like the culture of academia in general is a lot quicker than what is being suggested to us here, right? Like there's a book out there called The Slow Professor, which I'm not going to lie, I started reading and then I never finished reading, even though the book is like this thick. And it talks about the fact that moving slow and taking your time to think about things is really important in academia. But I would argue that the culture of academia doesn't allow for you often to really be able to take that time and dig in and do that deep thinking, because there's so many pressures on the metrics that you need to achieve. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's sort of what are you supposed to do in the end, right? It's unclear. And I think like I've been in this space for over 10 years now, so it's sort of like it makes sense to me now. Like it's not about necessarily taking it slow, but it's about prioritizing and like seeing like what matters to you next in your career, or what matters to you next in your specific research project or interest. And that way you can sort of like take it slow, in quote. But yeah, not like sort of running around with your head cut off and being like, oh, I need to do this, that, and this. I think, yeah, that's how I understood the advice, at least, of what to avoid. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And with all of that advice and thinking about what everybody said, upon your reflection, as you said, you've been doing this for about 10 years now. You're in your PhD. When you think about the beginning of your PhD, is there anything that you would have avoided or done a little bit differently? Is there anything I would have avoided? I think trying to like crystallize my PhD right away. Like, I think within 2 months of starting my PhD, I presented to about my proposed research to my department. And in retrospect, I don't know if that was that useful, because it just, really forced you to sort of like
put yourself in that position and didn't give you that time to really develop your project and think about it and all that. I think that's something I would have avoided to do because, once you've said something and presented something, you kind of, not that you're married to it, but you stick to it. It's been said, it's been presented, right? So
Right. Like you've put it out into the world.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I get that. I think that's I don't want to say a mistake necessarily, but I think that's a common experience for a lot of folks when they get into their PhD. It's almost like, I don't know about your experience, but in my experience, I felt like a pressure almost that like I had to have this idea put together as quickly as possible so that we could start moving forward. We could get ethics approval. We could start recruiting. We could start doing all these things. And I remember my supervisor at the time being like, you can take your first year just to take your courses and spend a lot of time thinking.
Yeah.
And then we can start crystallizing those ideas after you've spent some time thinking. And I just remember feeling like, oh my God, but then like that's a year gone. And then what are we supposed to do? And I don't know if you felt the same way where there was like a fear and a pressure about getting it done right away.
Absolutely. There's definitely that feeling. You go in so eager and you're like, yeah, let's just motor. We're going to get this PhD done in like 3 years, which is not going to happen, just to be clear here. But I think like part of what I find really interesting is that like the advice that was given is also like, I think it has to be learned through experience. Like if somebody told me some of this stuff, like when I first started my master's or even PhD, I would have been like, oh, okay, cool. But it wouldn't have sunk in. And now I listen to them and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I get it because I've lived it, right? Or different aspects of that. So it makes a lot of sense to me now. But I think there's something to be said about experiencing that, the slowness, the delays, the setbacks, the fact that ethics just ignored you for like 6 months, whatever, to be able to fully get that and sort of embody it and sort of chill out moving forward.
Right. Like part of the research game ultimately sometimes is waiting.
Oh, yeah.
Are there any other insights that you developed from watching this episode or any other notes that you wanted to touch on?
Yeah. One thing I want to talk about is what Tina said about, she sort of said, like, don't go out and do something new, like work out of your core strengths. And when I first heard that, I was like, well, I don't know if I agree with that because it's sort of like, you should be able to put yourself out of your comfort zone. But then like I thought about it again and you definitely need to be able to build out of what you already know because it's such a big field. Like research is so big and the world of research is so huge that it can be really tough to necessarily start from scratch. Like it can take years, right? So being able to sort of like, oh, I want to get into this world and I'm just going to like mosey over here and just like sort of bring it into my world instead of like doing the big jump, I think makes a big difference. And I think that makes a lot of sense and it allows you to sort of like expand without like starting from zero. And I think I never thought of it that way, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's multiple ways to start from what you know. It could be the content itself. It could be the methodology or the methods that you're using. It could be a combination of a little of the both. Maybe it's a different population. Maybe like there's multiple ways to be able to kind of bring those little pieces in, but still do something new with those pieces.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And sort of just slowly building up your expertise.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think another thing that this is always talked about, but just perseverance. There's so much, because like if you're going to research and doing a PhD, like you're doing your PhD, but life is still happening to you, like you're not in this little vacuum doing your PhD. You're usually a little older and there's stuff going on in your life. And so you can't necessarily just always be working on it. And I think that there will be setbacks. You'll have to deal with some life stuff, and then you'll have to come back, and sort of being okay with that, and being like, have that perseverance, and rejection, because you're just going to get rejected over and over again, right? Like just over and over, but then when you do get it, you get it, right? And nobody cares about the rejections. They just care about the fact that, you got that one scholarship or that one publication or whatever, right? So it's,
and the rejection isn't personal often.
It feels personal.
It does. I
sometimes,
know.
yeah.
But I think it's I think that's part of the lessons or part of the pieces that you end up learning while you're doing that. Because I definitely, at times when I get a rejection on something, I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, and I feel bad. Like, it hurts my heart, right? But then it's going back and being like, okay, this isn't a reflection of me as a human. This is a reflection of whatever is stated in this project or stated in this paper, or maybe this person didn't fully understand what was being articulated, or like maybe it was a miscommunication or something of the sort. But it's hard.
It is hard. Yeah, no, it doesn't feel good, especially like you've put in how many hours into it, right? And it's like, this is my project, this is my life, you know? And then
How
dare you just throw it away like that? Yeah. So no, I think, but like, I've become a lot better at it because now what I do, and I don't know if this is a healthy approach, but I expect rejection. So like I try to lower the bar as low as possible and then be like, oh, yay, a miracle happened, you know, instead of the opposite where I'm like, they will see my genius, you know, like instead, like just really bring it down to, and then like it makes you feel a lot better, right? Like no expectations, but it's hard to do, right? Because you still like a part of you is just like, maybe they'll like it.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you're still hopeful. But I think in that way, the fact that you're still trying and putting yourself out there, even though you're going in with the approach that you're expecting rejection, just shows like you're still playing the game. You're still trying your best. And maybe this is the time that all the stars will align and something good will happen with this, or it'll get accepted, or it'll get funded, or whatever the end result is.
No, exactly. Yeah. There's always hope, right? There's always hope.
So, Antoine, I not only want to thank you for being my co-host for this episode, but I also want to thank you for being the co-host of the final episode of Season 1. I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your insights with me.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And to everyone else, thank you so much for joining us for all of Season 1 of Ask 5. And we hope you'll be joining us for Season 2 soon.
Okay, good question. Yeah, that's a great question. Fair enough. Good question.
Great question. This is a fun question, as you said.
That's a great question. I love that question.
That's a really good question. Oh, it's such a good question again. These are great questions, Monica.
Thank you.
This looked different.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah. Do you have the hiccups?
I had one hiccup. So sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, we're not allowed to have
Get it out of the frame. So if you don't mind putting your headphones on, it's going to feel a little bit weird at first.
Is there a left-rightedness?
Yes, if you look up top. What's the frequency of children getting things stuck up their nose that you're dealing with?
Noses and ears, and so that the round bead ending up in the ear, it's almost like a magnetic, kind of thing. Well, I wonder if
So, Antoine, I wanted to thank you so much for being my co-host and for being the final co-host of Season 1.
Wow. Thank you. That was so good, though. Yeah, it was great.
I know. Easy. That's all we need, I think.
All right.